And thank you for the invitation to this exciting day. I've been looking forward to it. And thank you, Paul Harris, for a lovely display of very carefully done developmental psychological work on children's play. It's much needed. And I just must say that it's so important, this insight, that children are not that imaginative from the onset. That's also why I always tell professionals, you have to invite them into their worlds. You have to show them the world. You have to involve them in your activities in order to provide the material with which they will play. Young children play with what they have and what they know and what they care about. And the more they have, the more they know. And the more they care about, the more they play. So that's a very important point. However, I'm going to talk about young children's playing games. And that's an example, in fact, of border work between developmental psychology in its contextual version and childhood studies and social anthropological insights into children's cultural worlds. So I'm a bit more of a borderliner academic on this topic. So an alternative title to how are rules productive in children's play could be their own descriptions of what they're doing when they're playing games together. And, well, if you ask them about the rules and their status, they say, we play it our own way. They are creating rules when playing games in childcare. And that, of course, reflects their development, but it also reflects what they care about. And this is the juncture that I'm exploring in this talk. So, the status of rules in children's play is contested like the rest of the field of play studies. And we're going into some of those contestations in this talk. But I want to make clear that I distinguish quite clearly between play, generically speaking, and children's play, and young children's play, and the play that takes place in childcare. These are different scenes for play. And, well, we're going to talk a bit about play with rules, like this idea that this is a specific kind of play. And when we talk about rules within this way of looking at it, it's explicit formal rules. Or another way of looking at it is that all social life is governed by norms and rules. So there is no play without rules. It's just maybe another way of looking at what rules are. And I'm going to use all the time an example from my fieldwork in a Danish childcare center where a group of primarily boys, but not only boys, but primarily boys, definitely dominating boys, are playing soccer together in the playground. And I'm using that in order to theorize what are rules in the child's world and how does it sort of govern their playing activity. And my main point is that the motivational structure in playing in childcare is to explore and sustain and develop their social existence in the peer group. So, and to the extent that the rules sort of serve them well in that regard, they follow them. Otherwise, they bend them and transform them. And we're going to see an example of that in a minute. So why is it important and relevant to add that we're dealing with young children's play and games? Surely after hearing Paul Harris talk, we know that children, in fact, are in the world in a different way than older children and adolescents and adults. They share a range of developmental characteristics with regard to what they usually care about and what they understand and how they appreciate things and what they typically engage with in the world. So, when it comes to games, I think, for instance, it's quite significant and characteristic for them that they're not really competitive. It's not the main point for their playing, whether they win or lose. Maybe that might actually, in fact, also be a cultural thing. I'm sure you could cultivate small children to be very competitive, but in that environment where I was, that wasn't the case. They were cooperative. They were in it to join. And of course, that sort of reflects how they appreciate rules. So they're practicing the rules to the extent that the rules enable them to sustain and bring excitement to the game, which is a completely different strategy around how to follow and appreciate rules in a game like soccer. So this is a tentative definition. We struggle a lot in play theory and play research with definitions. It's very hard to come up with an exhaustive definition of all kinds of play. But this would maybe be sort of covering what we think of when we think of games. Games are competitive with a particular goal in deciding between a winner and a loser. This is the main difference between social pretend play and games, right? And who is winning or losing is determined through enacting and performing particular roles or tasks, like kicking the ball and having a score at the goal, within the constraints of these explicit rules. So, of course, rules are productive because they create the range of action possibilities that define the game itself. So it's not like rules are external or abstract context for a game. They are internal to the very existence of that game. And how they are understood and performed and appreciated, of course, governs that very game. So, the main points that I'm going to make is that when young children play games, and these are like 4- and 5-year-olds that I've been studying, they are exactly playful with the game. A soccer game in many ways resembles more a play with soccer than the sporting game of soccer proper. And just as it is the case with social pretend play, a game like soccer involves a lot of sore points that points into their social realities, their peer group life, their bonding with their friends. And this is also what makes their negotiations intense and vigid and full of sometimes joy and excitement, but also full of disappointments and crying and quarreling. So this is very much what is the context around how they perform their games. So the rules are productive because they enable the game to continue and to remain an exciting arena for performing and exploring one's position as player and one's existence in the group as member of this soccer-playing boys team in childcare. So, just to go a little bit more into how rules are understood, both in developmental accounts and in other ways, I paraphrase game theorist and post-structuralist Tullock here. He says, there are few concepts as central to the study of gaming as rules. However, there are few concepts so frequently overlooked and under-theorized. And this goes maybe generally for children's games. We know much more, although not enough, about social pretend play than we do of young children's gaming and, you know, the developmental potentials with games. And I would say that very crudely put, there are two main positions on play with rules. One is quite binary, and you would find that in the account, for instance, made by Piaget, that, you know, there are different forms of play, and in games, rules is part of the game, or that, you know, this is where rules have a relevance. So this is a binary either-or conception of it. And then you have a more scalar conception, and that would be the position made by Vygotsky, who would say that there is no play without rules. It's only a question of how, to the extent they dominate and to the extent that they are formalized. And he makes that point with reference to a social pretend play, where he says when children play a family social pretend play, they adhere to the norms and rules about what a sister is like, what a mother is like, what a brother is like, and that's what they use as manuscript for how they enact that role. So this is a more scalar approach to appreciation of rules and their role in children's play. And of course, there are formal rules and informal rules, and we should be aware of not comparing pears and apples, because then they're not in fact talking about the same phenomena, because the binary approach are thinking about formal explicit rules, and the other is more loose around how to define rules. But in the binary approach, rules are formal and restrictive, and it's very much a focus on what the rules prohibit. Well, you can't pick up and throw the ball with your hands in football. That's a rule. You have to kick the ball with your foot, right? And the rules are taken to be prescriptive and decisive in determining who is winning. So it's quite important that you follow them strictly in order to be fair, basically. And also, which is very important, the same rules apply to all in the same way from game to game, right? Where the rules in the scalar understanding are both formal and informal, and they are, rather than being looked upon as prohibiting particular actions, they're focusing on what it is that the rules enable. So a rule also enables particular actions by constraining the field of possible actions. And the rules are seen as more negotiable, and they sometimes apply to all. And they resemble norms, social norms, more than laws. That's why they're more informal. And there's no doubt that young children's appreciations of rules in actual game playing resemble more the scalar approach. Yeah. And now I'm going to just show you a snapshot from the childcare center where I did my research. We enter into an ongoing soccer match. This group of boys that I followed for 6 months, they play every day if they can. They play if the snow or rains. They play this game of soccer, and it's also a very important part of the whole community. This is a rural setting. Everybody talks about the Champions League. They watch the TV. So football is a very important cultural activity among the whole community. And these boys are also playing at the local soccer team in their spare time. So this is a hugely important activity for them. And that's what they use all their playtime doing this. So this is their play world. And we're meeting them in the midst of a game. And I'll analyze it with you afterwards, but here it is. I'm just going to read it aloud for you. The usual players are in the midst of the game. Jules has a go at the goal and scores. And he cries out in joy. It doesn't count, the others are shouting. It turns out now that the goalkeeper, Noah, wasn't really watching the goal, so the goal doesn't count. And Alex, as referee, confirms this decision and says, yes, it's annulled. And Jules just readily accepts this, and the game continues. Now, Alex, he wants somebody else to be referee and tries to convince Ollie and Noah. So he sort of interrupts the game by his boredom. He looks very bored by the fence. This is the role of referee, not as attractive as being actually playing on the field, right? Now Nick is tackled and he falls to the ground where he rolls around in agony. And I must say, this really looks like the adult players when they hit themselves and, like screaming and rolling around on the field. This he does as well. But no one really takes notice. Now he then blames Alex for not correcting Andy, who got at him. And then he leaves the field in anger. This is more than he can take. So Andy and Philip follow him in order to encourage him to come back and join the game again. And so he does, and he's very agitated and demands a free kick from right in front of the goal if he's to participate again. And now Noah is more concerned with avoiding the ball than preventing the score. So Nick scores this time. And he yells in happy excitement, and his team celebrates by cheering him. They all jump around and fall around each other's necks. And importantly, they all do, from both teams, team up, sing about their victory, right? Exactly, again, like the adult players that we sometimes see when a very important goal sort of sets the game. So this is just, this might be a bit more exciting than some other games. They all have a different mood and a different sort of trajectory. But this is not uncommon among them, that they have all these emotions playing out between them and a lot of quarreling and negotiation and deciding all the time and creating choices for each other as a group. So one of the advantages of studying play in real-life contexts like this is that we sometimes can see some of the myths in adults' understanding of child's worlds, you know. In this case, you know, obviously, it's not just fun playing soccer. It's everything. It's exciting. It's disappointing. It's boring. It's a lot of things. And rules are very productive because they regulate sort of the social fate and existence of the players on the squad through both their restrictive and at the same time their transformative function. So you can give leeway if someone cries, and then, you know, you keep the group together. Always, you know, the same goal of remaining participating in this game. So their game-playing soccer in this instance resembles social pretend play quite a lot, and much more than proper soccer, or a game with rules as we would understand it as adults. And this is the model that I use. It's developed by my old supervisor from Copenhagen University, Ivi Skovsbo. And it was in fact developed in order to exactly account for children's social pretend play. But I find it very interesting also to look at children's games through this model. And it serves as a heuristic device to understand what it is the children are, what is their particular mode of being in the world when they are playing. And what she says is that they play according to the sphere of reality. They're relating to the world in different spheres of reality. One of them is the actual factual reality of the material world. Well, they only play soccer if there's a squad for it and if they can find the ball. So they're quite depending on the environmental affordances for their activities. This sphere also, in fact, includes who are the exact other players around and how many are they, and all these sort of factual material conditions. And then the sphere of staging, that would be the meta communication, the framing and the setting of the scene. This is where all the negotiations take place. This is where they quarrel and decide on teams and discuss whether this goal counts or not. And then there's the sphere of imagination. And of course, when you think of games, maybe that should have been called something like the sphere of enactment. But I find it quite likely that when they are kicking the ball and scoring their goals, they are in fact in symbolic worlds identifying with their favorite players from the adult world of football. They also, you know, sometimes call each other that, you know, the names from their favorite teams. So there's definitely pretend material in this kind of gaming football like they do. And what we should take with us is that, of course, this is an ideal model. And well, the idea is that when the scene is set and you have sort of figured out who is to be who, and you've quarreled about who is to be referee, which no one really wants to be, then you can start playing. And then if you're lucky enough, you can enjoy that space of being completely one with the enactment, playing the ball, having a kick, having the goal. You know, this sort of flow of being into it. In social pretend play, that would be being into the pretended scenario, identifying with it. And here, being into being this Graversen football player or whatever their names were, you know, yes, I'm not an expert on real football. So this is, I think, actually quite an illustrative model for why play becomes so captivating when you are in the midst of it, because it's the enactment or the fictional sphere that sort of can absorb all your attention and your whole sort of performance in it. Yeah. And when I then analyzed the games, both using this model and recognizing that this model also applies to children's games with soccer, I also came across a huge work and framework for children's games and rules. She suggests, and she's a social anthropologist looking into children's play, She suggests that we need to appreciate 3 kinds of different rules that accommodate these activities for children. There's, of course, the rules of the game. These are the formal, explicit ones. You know, a score counts as a point. You can only kick the ball, and an equal amount of players are to be on each team. All these kinds of things. You can, if you kick the ball too far from the field, it's out. All these kinds of rules. And then there's rules of the social context. And in this particular situated environment, that could be what constitutes the field. You know, this is their own homemade field right next to the fence to the schoolyard, and then there's a blurry boundary into the rest of the playground. So that's a little bit negotiable. But it's also like, well, the one who finds the ball first is the one who is the main decisor on who's going to compose each team. So these are local social context rules that they've developed together. And then there are more sort of meta rules, rules for rules. And that could be, in this case, a friend belonging to this soccer playing team is always welcome in the game. So you'll always find a seat for somebody who's part of this group to join the game. Also, it's quite gendered here. Only boys are truly soccer players in this environment. And in fact, there are 2 girls, and they are quite skilled from an adult perspective, quite good players. But they are just simply disenfranchised in this community. They can never really count as true soccer players. And also, the teams must be even, but not necessarily in amount of players, but you know, in how well they play, so it doesn't become lopsided. So, and in general, just that fairness, the idea of fairness, is not adhering to the rules, but aligned with their social identities and hierarchy between themselves and among themselves. So this is my interpretation of what kinds of rules they were creating together in this group. First, the person who finds the ball is always allowed to play and take the lead in deciding who is on which team. And this is the girl's chance, right? So if she's the one running the most fast to the playground after lunch and she gets hold of the ball, she owns the place. She can decide on the teams. And they'll be all, oh, they don't want to be on her team, but they must sort of accept her participation. And then there are an equal number of players in each team, but only mostly. And if someone is hurt, the player is mostly compensated, but that also depends on who was the victim. And when a child kicks a ball in the head of another child, the sanction is red or yellow card, and it depends entirely on kicker and victim. So if Rasmus is in any way hurt, he's always overly compensated. Well, so that's how that works. And a score at the goal gives 1 point, unless someone has a persuasive argument against it, which is quite often, or if the kick of the ball is so direct and thus so perfect so that the goalkeeper didn't have a chance, then that doesn't count either. So you see, this is really sort of a very peculiar way of going around formal playing rules. And I must say, and this is also the point, developmentally, these ways of doing things would have created a lot of ballad in the schoolyard in middle childhood, right? This would have really violated older children's conception of fairness, truly. So they would really cry if they did a goal score and it was annulled. You know, that's just not how things work for middle childhood children. But this is how it works in their conception of it here. So, well, this example is an example of this border work that I'm doing. I'm trying to bridge gaps between mainly insights from childhood studies and anthropological accounts of children's cultural worlds and meaning-making by entering their real-life contexts. But I am definitely also applying a contextual developmental account. I think those 2 things need to go together in order to understand what is going on in fact. So the synthesis would be, what do children's play look like in everyday life of childcare? This is the setting of childcare. They also play at home, and they play in other settings where other rules might apply, right? And what is the meaning of this activity to their cultural and personal existence? And how does their participation in play activities enable them to develop capabilities and concerns to remain skillful actors in their environments across time? I think that's, of course, crucial when we have to do with young children who are supposed to become and stay skillful actors all along, also when they start in school and when they, are going to grow up eventually. So this is my approach, and I don't know what to call it. I'm still working on that. So why is it that young children don't care about the rules of the game in the same sense that older children and we do? Because it's quite prominent if you remember Hughes' categories, that the most prominent rules in their play are rules for rules. It's not the rules of the game. And why is that so? And the typical answer from developmental psychology would be that they don't appreciate these formal abstract rules. They simply don't get it. They don't grasp it. They don't comprehend it right. And I'm not saying that that's not true. I think there's definitely an aspect to that. They do not appreciate these formal games of the rule, so they don't perform according to those. But in fact, actually, the latest developmental research on this also suggests, in fact, that from around the year of 3 years, they do appreciate that rules are arbitrary, and therefore they can be changed and transformed. But my answer would be more in the line of children play with issues in their lives that they're concerned with and care about. And in childcare, peer group life and relationship with friends, peers, what is friendship? Who are my friends? And issues of loyalty, fairness, supportiveness, popularity. Why don't he want to sit with me? All these questions, they're still rather new territory for young children. And they're governed by norms and structures and consequences that are very challenging and quite mystical to 5-year-olds. So this is highly relevant for them. They're super motivated to learn about that and learn to master it. So the rules for rules are much more exciting context for them to explore and learn to master. And they do so. They are learning to master them together. And they also learn to create these choices together by transforming and negotiating those rules in their own way, as they say. We play it our own way. And in that sense, I think children's playing, both in games and pretend playing, is in fact an existential project to them. We could understand it as an existential project to them. So, and on a final note on the developmental potential in games, I think it's not as much about is it digital or how much are they playing on digital tablet games and whatever. What really is, I think, important to assess and be concerned with is if the game merely invites to making choices. And this you could become very skillful at, making fast choices, right choices, tapping the right or memorizing the right, what it is. But it is merely making choices, and that makes it a consuming position for the child. It's consuming the game. Whereas what I think we have quite clear examples of in this soccer playing community of boys, they are creating choices together. They're producing the game rather than merely consuming it. And I think that's the crucial difference that we ought to take notice of, whether that then is happening on digital platforms or in analog, old-fashioned social pretend, social dramatic play, or games of soccer. So this was my final point.